All right, looks like it's time for us to go save the people of Burkina Faso. This guy got on U.S. Senate hearing and said that the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, has become a threat to his own people. You already know what that means, what that sounds like. That means it's time for us to go liberate the people of Burkina Faso. And of course, they're going to use a black man. The blackface is always a house nick. Every time they're going to use, every time they want to use violence on black people, they use a black man from the West to come bring it on Africans. Like, America has realized they have black people in power who they can use now to destroy Africa. But yes, this house Michael Langley is now the guy who's going to be the face of America going into Burkina Faso.
Trump's war on Africa exposed, and his issues with Ibrahim Traore, Sudan genocide, and more. Welcome to This Week in Africa, a collaborative effort between Authentic Africa and Gloria Ayo, where we break down this week's breaking news and its impact on Pan-Africanism and Africa's independence. Join us as we discuss all things pertaining to African news this past week. Before we get into today's news, we like to start off with introductions. So I'll turn it over to my co-host to introduce herself before I introduce myself.
Well, hello, it's me, Gloria Ayo, back again for another wonderful round. I guess you can call me a content creator who's very passionate about all things African. And I always like to look at the broader context, how things throughout the globe help shape things that affect us as Africans. Very happy to be here again.
Yes, welcome back, and I'm excited to have you. So we're going to be doing this weekly, as you guys know, so just stay tuned every Thursday at 9 p.m. GMT, which means that it could change times, EST, PST, if you live in the United States, but just know it will always be at the same time. So I am Joe Hatagwa. I am the founder of Authentic African and AuthenticAfrican.com. Where we focus on all things pertaining to Africa and the diaspora, bridging the gap between the two, with the goal of making sure that people visit, move, and invest on the continent of Africa. So with that, we are going to dive into this week's stories. First, I just want to talk about the video we watched at the onset. And then we can talk about it a little bit before we get into some of the other videos and topics that we want to discuss today. So the U.S. has plans for Burkina Faso, but none are good. You want to listen to the brother Issa Bako, who explained how the empire has perfected the use of black faces in high places in order to do the dirt of the one USA. During a 3rd of April U.S. Senate hearing, the head of U.S. Africa Command, which is called AFRICOM, General Michael Langley, accused Burkina Faso's leader, Ibrahim Traore, of using Burkina Faso's resources like gold, not for the people, but to consolidate his position. Just as they did with Gaddafi, who was targeted and subsequently unalived in an invasion launched by, unfortunately, the first Black U.S. president in history. It seems to be that there is a similar plot on the rise. But why accuse Burkina Faso of corruption with no evidence when there are more obvious suspects? There are some Western-aligned neighbors in Nigeria and other places who've lost 20 trillion in corruption and more in 4 decades. Meanwhile, in Kenya, evidence exists of elites enriching themselves at the expense of the people who are also aligned with the West. And President William Ruto's expensive private flights rather than using state airplanes. Former Kenyan President Kenyatta also allegedly stored loot abroad. So similar to Gaddafi's Libya, Burkina Faso's government that came to power in 2022, people-backed coup that made sovereignty a non-negotiable by taking control of their country from the West. The country has kicked out French troops and some media and has nationalized 2 gold mines from which a British mining company profited. The U.S. has nothing to say for the years that France enacted neo-colonialism by controlling Burkina Faso resources, economy, and politics, but is up in arms against a government that enjoys popular support, not just in Burkina Faso, and not just around the continent, but around the world alike. Additionally, the United States has its own issues of corruption that goes unchecked, which elected officials engaging in insider trading in industries over which they have regulatory oversight. Now, this is coming from our friends at African Stream. Just wanted to read their commentary because I thought it was useful in terms of historical context, but it was a little bit fiery. So I just want to be clear, those are not my words. Those are African Stream's words. But with that, I want to ask you, Gloria, based on the video we just watched and what we know the history of Western engagements with political leaders like Traore, what do you think about this idea that AFRICOM is now saying that he's a problem?
So this is my general issue. Let's even forget whether or not they're telling the truth. My big concern with the West and when they interfere in African politics is the hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
They're so good at picking and choosing who is good for Africans and who is not based on their interests. You remember what happened with the coup in Niger?
Mm-hmm.
How America had the audacity. Anthony Blinken even literally said, this partnership is so important because it affects our economic and strategic interest. You literally said that. This wasn't, you said it live on TV. So it shows you how much they look at Africa. Africa is just the big elephant that everybody just wants to take from. You don't care about Africans. Clearly, the people of the continent, if not, maybe, obviously not everybody, but you have a huge chunk of people rooting for Traoré. But somehow you want to find a way to rewrite the story and paint him in this bad light. Traoré is obviously not perfect, but there are way more imperfect people. If you want to put him in the category of being imperfect, there are way more imperfect people in Africa. I'm going to use an example. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden had problems with, obviously, the Niger coup, and being that Bola Tinubu was the chair of, or is the chair of ECOWAS, there was this alliance with him to get everything right and fix Niger and take care. You're worried about a coup, but in Nigeria, that same year, there was a political coup, and you turned your eyes away from it, and you had an alliance with this person. I don't even have a problem with you, having your alliances, but it was just very hypocritical how all of a sudden America was so impassioned and so active. So when you come for a guy like Traoré, and it's so unfortunate that it had to be a brother, because that was when I saw it, I said, "Oh no, not Lord have mercy," because this is not going to go well for him as far as commentaries. It had to be him. It's just very unfortunate. I think it's time for the West to just stay. We know it's not about love. You don't care. It's just about your interest at the end of the day, period. If the people are not complaining, don't complain on our. You can't cry more than the bereaved. Leave it alone.
There it is. Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? We have this policy here in the States of we do not enforce regime change. We no longer believe in regime change, except when it's someone who doesn't agree with us, right? That there's always, like, they don't say the accept part, but it's obviously the accept that, because as you said, there are many people who agree with that stance that that it was a coup that led to the APC party winning the election in Nigeria. There was political violence and all kinds of things happening. Roads closed down to not allow people to vote. There was, intimidation tactics, all kinds of different things. Yep. And, someone whose campaign slogan was "It's my turn," right, ends up winning. And it's obvious that there was a groundswell for someone else, right? There's obviously that it was obvious, you just looking by the numbers, that someone else should have won. And they didn't win because the party that was in power previously led to the party that ended up being in power again. And so, yeah, but we, of course, as you said, the West was all fine with that because apparently that leader is much more inclined to abide by what the West would like, as opposed to some of these other folks who might be working more with the Far East, like, for instance, China and Russia, which is, of course, not an ally to the United States. So with that, I want to speak more on what's been happening, because the U.S. and Africa relations are going to continue to sour, right? We talked about tariffs last week. We talked about this particular story here, but there's more. There's more. You know, the DRC, which, you know, is a country that we've been talking about a lot on this platform, and I know you've spoken about on yours as well. You know, there's so much loss of life occurring there. There's so so much exploitation happening. I mean, there's everything from child labor to trafficking to military unaliving of large swaths of people being displaced. There's like all of the famine, like all of the things are happening at once, right? In a country that has more natural resources than any other country in the world. It's the richest country in terms of its natural resources, but one of the poorest in terms of how the people are able to benefit from those resources. So with that, I do want to get to our fearless leader here in the United States, his response and his discussion of the country of DRC.
They released jails, Georgia, from all over the world, and released them, not just South America, all over the world, the Congo and Africa. Many, many people come from the Congo. I don't know what that is, but they came from the Congo. And all over the world they came in, opened their jails, Venezuela.
You're on mute.
I was on mute. So he obviously has a dismissive tone anytime he talks about Africa, the alleged S-hole countries, from a previous administration, no one's ever heard of Lithoso. Listen, right? And then of course this issue here with the DRC. So what are your thoughts on this in his flippant commentary about the continent of Africa and how he describes immigrants that come from there?
I just want to say that for as long as we keep doing this, for as long as Trump is president, we're going to always have to. I think we should even have a whole segment because he's going to keep giving. Trump is the gift that keeps giving. But anyway, they say that this is their plan to help streamline government operations and reduce federal spending. And even though Marco Rubio has publicly dismissed this as fake news, internal documents suggest otherwise. Since the Cold War, the US has had a diplomatic presence in Africa in the 1990s, the 2000s, especially through programs like PEPFAR, which is actually for HIV and AIDS relief, and of course through AGOA. Embassies evolved from just being a place for processing. Okay, now I'm jumping ahead of the story. But I'm going to come back to the comment on the DRC. Embassies evolved from being a place for processing visas and collecting visas. Now, the DRC being targeted, for instance, in this way, and you talk about the DRC not being a known country, the DRC being targeted is very ironic as far as I'm concerned. Is the same person who previously had said that nobody has ever heard of Lesotho, and then it turns around and it slaps them with the highest tariff, 50%. You're saying you don't know what the DRC is. I don't know what that is. But you turn around and they're part of the, sorry to preempt the story, Joe, they're part of the embassies you're targeting, allegedly, right? So to talk about a place like DRC the way he has is extremely disrespectful. Yes, we know Trump is going to Trump, right? But it's extremely, extremely disrespectful to accuse the people of Congo of releasing prisoners to the US who then become migrants. There's no proof of this. Records show that there's no proof of this. And then you say you don't know what that is. Well, let me tell you what that is. One of your biggest tech allies, Elon Musk, is a major beneficiary of Congo. Yes. Congo is the world's #1 producer of cobalt. Cobalt, as we all know, is used in electric vehicle batteries, including those made by Tesla. So Elon is literally building the future of American innovation on Congolese materials. It's like you're eating at a very fancy restaurant, eating a fancy meal, but you're dismissing the farmer. Congo is the farmer in this story. So Trump needs to learn to put some respect on African names, on African countries. Enough of the dismissive tone. It just sounds like a case where clearly you need to tune into This Week in Africa. You need to listen to me on the African Story. You really need to enlighten yourself about Africa and stop being so dismissive of things that have to do. And I don't want to disrespect anybody who is a Trump fan, but in supporting Trump, especially if you're an African, in supporting Trump, you have to learn, we have to learn to call out what is wrong and what is right. Or rather, call out, if he's crossing certain lines, we have to call him to order. It's not everything Trump says that is going to be right. When it comes to Africa, there's been a lot of disrespect, a lot of what looks like targeting, but I'll get into that when we go into more details on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, right, and Mosi makes a good point here. Aren't they trying to strike a mineral deal? How does he not know? That's a good point, right? Because there was discussions with the president of the DRC about a mineral deal, very similar to the one that they had attempted to strike with the Ukraine, where Trump was calling it the raw earth materials, I think is what he was trying to say. Okay, but yeah, so to get to that point, you mentioned the embassy, so let's talk a little bit about that. So you know, as you mentioned, there are news reports revealing that the administration is considering closing nearly 30 U.S. embassies and consulates worldwide, with many located in Africa. This move would be part of a sweeping shakeup at the State Department, driven by Elon Musk-backed DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, with a focus on shrinking federal operations. In Africa, embassy closures are being considered in Eritrea, Gambia, Lesotho, the DRC, as we mentioned before, South Sudan, and South Africa. The U.S. may shut down its consulate, while diplomatic missions to Somalia could face downsizing, despite their critical role in counterterrorism efforts, well, at least in terms of what they say. Closures are also on the table in other countries around the world. But in Africa, the impact could be far more profound. So we're going to jump into a video and give our thoughts on the other side.
New reports reveal that the Trump administration is considering closing nearly 30 U.S. embassies and consulates worldwide. Many of them are located in Africa. The U.S. is looking to shut down 10 embassies and 17 consulates across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. In Africa, embassy closures are being considered in Eritrea, Gambia, Lesotho, Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. In South Africa, the U.S. could shut its consulate, while diplomatic missions in Somalia may face downsizing despite their critical role in counterterrorism. Now, the plan is still under review and would need sign-off from Secretary of State Marco Rubio or the White House. Now, Trump's policies have already altered U.S.-Africa relations. Many nations are facing aid withdrawals, tougher immigration rules, and deportation orders. In South Africa, diplomatic relations have soured after Trump accused the country of mistreating white farmers. But as the U.S. pulls back, other global powers are rushing in to fill the void. China, Russia, Turkey, and the Gulf states are deepening trade, infrastructure, and defense ties across the continent.
All right. So, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Somebody made a statement that Africa should be celebrating the closure of American embassies. I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, but I'd love to hear your thoughts first, and then I would I'll give my thoughts after.
Yeah, and that's some people have that opinion, and I absolutely understand why they feel that way or they think that. But an embassy goes beyond just processing a visa, right, or collecting a visa. It's also a place for development of aid, security partnerships. So embassies are very important, right? Even in smaller nations like Lesotho or the Gambia, a U.S. embassy represents soft power and global engagement. So I wouldn't say, like you said, it's a double-edged sword. But the interesting thing is, while the US was waging a global war on terror issues in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, China was moving aggressively into Africa, building embassies, building roads, building ports and railways. And this is why the US has been playing catch up pre-Trump. The US was playing catch up, in recent years. And that's why there have been a lot of military training missions throughout Africa. And while there's a program, Prosper Africa, which obviously is on hold right now, like other programs are, but Prosper Africa was also established because of the US trying to play catch up. Now, what does this all mean? These things going on with Trump, the rumors of embassies being closed. What would this look like for US-Africa relations? We talked about this last week, how this is, how countries like China take advantage, even more advantage of, moves like this that the US makes, because they get to strengthen their ties on the continent. As for the US, I'm just going to call it what it is. This is not a budget move. This is a retreat. What you're saying to African countries, especially smaller or politically unstable African countries, is that they're no longer a priority. This man, obviously, years ago, called African countries S-hole countries. So you don't rate African countries. And what is going to happen is you're going to leave a vacuum. And you know who's ready to fill the vacuum? China, Russia, Turkey. So if these embassies do get closed, this will not be good for America strategically, because closing them will weaken US influence. And what even happens when there's a crisis? If you think this is just going to affect Africans, how about the US citizens that live in these countries? That's another role of a US embassy.
Absolutely.
Because what happens when there's a crisis? How do they hear about potential conflict or instability? So you're not just hurting Africans, you're also hurting Americans in these countries, because diplomatic intelligence will definitely be affected. And as we said last week, China has had its issues. China, I'm quite funny about, but as you pointed out, Joe, they are being the better partner. China is far more respectful than the West has been. China is, again, building more embassies, they're funding infrastructure, they're courting African leaders nonstop. So this isn't just policy, it's perception. And perception eventually becomes policy.
Yep.
The same Trump, who is claiming not to know all these countries, is coming for them so hard. You're not just isolating these countries, you're insulting them. And I think it's performative, and it shows a lack of strategic foresight.
Well put. Yeah, I mean, and look, I renewed my passport at the Sierra Leonean embassy because it was going to expire before I had the chance to travel. And as you mentioned, look, when Sierra Leone had its civil war, right? Those American citizens were able to get to the American embassy and get out. And so, we don't want to speak to just the negative things that happen in the country, because as you mentioned, diplomatic ties are really important for all of those things. And continued strategic engagement. Look, at the end of the day, Africa is the richest continent in the world in terms of its natural resources. And so that means that people are going to need to be doing business around these natural resources. And ideally that is done above board, in plain sight, right? And done in a way that obviously benefits Africans. And we still have to get to that point. We're not there yet. But as you said, and as we talked about previously, it seems like the Far East has stepped in as the West has stepped out. And so we'll just have to see how Africa becomes more self-sufficient, self-reliant, begins to work with each other. So I mentioned the double-edged sword, or because I do see this as, not useful, but also might light a fire to focus more within, instead of looking for help externally, figuring out how do we do more trade internally. One of the biggest challenges I have with the continent of Africa is that my US passport allows me to go more places than my Sierra Leone passport on the continent of Africa. And so I hope that things like this allows Africans to think more strategically about how we work together, as opposed to focusing so much on how we benefit from relationships with the United States, who really, as you can see, outwardly or not always publicly, doesn't really respect the continent in general.
Right.
Okay, so with that being said, any other thoughts? Yeah, please.
I just wanted to add to what you said about the limitations when it comes to traveling within the continent. How about the expense?
Yeah.
Travel to other countries in Africa. These are things to think about. We have work to do as a continent. If we take care of ourselves, people from the outside won't come in to disrespect us the way they are doing. We all need to borrow a leaf from Burkina Faso. It is the man is being self-sufficient. However, we want to slice it. That's what's going on over there.
Yeah. And these things sometimes they're going to be ugly, or sometimes they're going to be things that you don't agree with, and we'll maybe dig into the stories a little bit another time, and in particular when it pertains to the AES and specifically Burkina Faso. But look, self-sufficiency is really important. That means that you can operate autonomously, and then as a collective, those three countries now can negotiate so much better than they could as individual countries. And I just hope that as they continue to thrive and become, Mali's the fastest growing economy in the world right now. Burkina Faso is obviously, they're looking to get rid of all their debt. By doing all of what they're doing, it seems as if they are changing the complexion of the country and changing the minds of people on the ground. It's interesting how I hear about all kinds of different people around the continent who look up to Ibrahim Traoré and want to and hope that their leadership embodies what he's doing. And we'll get into it later, but it seems like other leaders are looking to engage a little bit more, which I'm interested in seeing how that turns out. And we'll talk about that a bit later. So with that, I do want to transition to the discussion about the Pope. Because if many of you guys may or may not be aware, the Pope just recently passed this past weekend. Pope Francis, he was from a third world country. So his relationship with Africa, well, so-called third world country. So his relationship with Africa was very different than John Paul II, the guy who was like the interim Pope, whatever, well, not the interim Pope, but right after him before, and then stepping down before Francis came in. They all would say things, but it was interesting to see how this Pope would do things to show, how he wanted to see better Africa than what he was seeing. So what I want to do is mention that he visited several African countries, focusing on issues like poverty, conflict, and climate change. His visits to Kenya, Uganda, and the Central African Republic in 2015, where he called for peace and reconciliation. In 2017, he visited Egypt to promote interfaith dialogue and support the Christian community there. Later in 2019, he traveled to Mozambique, Madagascar, and Mauritius, advocating for peace, social justice, and environmental protection. Throughout his visits, he always emphasized solidarity with Africans and Africa's marginalized populations. So with that, we're going to hop into a video, and then we'll have some commentary on the other side.
November 2015, 2 years after his election, Pope Francis made his first trip to Africa as leader of the Catholic Church. Over the course of 6 days, the pontiff traveled to Kenya, Uganda, and the Central African Republic, a long-awaited moment for the 200 million Catholics living on the continent. There he met with political and religious leaders, but also insisted on visiting disenfranchised communities.
The path of Jesus started on the periphery. It goes towards the poor, and with the poor, towards everyone else.
In April 2017, Pope Francis arrived in Cairo for an international peace conference. Together with Muslim and Christian leaders, he denounced inter-religious violence and called for greater tolerance and unity between beliefs.
We must accompany young people, help them find their own path by teaching them to ward off evil and to patiently work towards the common good.
Beyond religious strife, Pope Francis also acted as a peacemaker in armed conflicts, including in South Sudan's civil war.
So I'll end it there because we have another video that we'll play after that kind of speaks to that. Now, look, this is a complicated story because the Catholic Church has a complicated history, a long and storied history, especially in the United States, where the Boston Globe broke that story of some of the things that were happening to children there. So I do want to make sure that we don't gloss over that fact, you know. However, I think what Pope Francis was focusing on we need to see more of, right? And we'll get to a story later that has some challenges with interfaith conflicts. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the impact that Francis had and how, you know, Africa has seen, you know, the Catholic Church and specifically Pope Francis.
Yeah, we should give him credit for, you know, being able to increase the cardinals throughout Africa. I think from 8% to about 12% or something like that. But just helping Africa get more included. And of course, there's been a growing, there's been an increase of Catholics throughout the continent. And we can give him credit for that. You know, for 1/5 of the globe's population that are Catholics to be from Africa, so that's a high number. That's huge. So there is a major influence when it comes to Africa. Africa has a major influence on the faith. Yes, we may have things we disagree with as far as the Catholic Church, but Francis did far more good for the continent than, I mean, he deserves to be celebrated. This was a man who was committed to Africa. His first 5 visits to 10 countries during his 12-year papacy says a lot. Like, he visited 5, you know, that just says a lot. Like, he prioritized Africa. And the fact that he went to these countries that were faced with conflict, with poverty, with social challenges, showed the kind of heart that he had. Some of my favorite visits, for me, this would be, I think there are like 3 that I actually really appreciate him for. His visit to Egypt in 2017, where he stood alongside the Grand Imam to promote religious coexistence, was powerful. And then the visit you referenced to Mozambique, Madagascar, Mauritius, focusing on climate change, focusing on how to relieve these people of poverty, speaks volumes. Africa contributes the least to climate issues, yet Africa bears the biggest brunt of climate issues. So having a voice as big as the Pope's was really good for the continent. And then his visit just 2 years ago, which you'll get to, I'm sure, in a bit, while in Congo, his ability to stand firmly against exploitation of Africa's resources was a lot. For somebody to say, stay away from Congo, keep your hands off Africa, a man with a voice that powerful, shows the love he had for the continent. And finally, my favorite visit was the one he did to his visit to Sudan in 2019. That was shocking, you know, but I'll let you get to that before I speak on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get to that video in a second. But to answer this question, Get Black with Me, right, is exactly that. Like so whether you agree with the Catholic Church or the Christian Church or whatever, I think the important thing is the sheer number of Christians already on the continent and the voice, as you said, the voice that the Pope has, right? So him speaking about what's happening in the DRC is bringing more light to the challenges that are happening there, and that is going to help in some way, shape, or form. You know, obviously what he does in his role doesn't generally have to do a lot with finances, but a lot of these symbolic moves are important, right? When you're standing with the Grand Imam of a country who you know, obviously where they've had religious unrest at times in the past. And we have that throughout the history of the continent of Africa. And we'll talk about what's happening in Nigeria in a moment. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of things are important because I think whether it's symbolic and or it has any other direct impact, when you see that changes the way you see things, right? So if you see these two groups coming together and if they can do it, right? Because leadership starts from the top down, right? And so you'll hear a lot of people who are, you know, bribing and stuff on the streets. You'll say, well, the president does it. That's why I do it, right? So it's the same thing with your religious leaders. If you see the religious leaders saying, we need to work together and we need to see that we have more in common than we don't, then you also will have folks that trickles down. So to ask the question why it's important, that's why it's important, right? So whether you agree or disagree, it is really important to know that he was always highlighting the continent for what needs to be fixed, and also for what is to be admired about the continent. So that's why it's important.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, I do want to take a moment to kind of get to this next video, because I think it speaks to how he would approach things when he went to the continent. And this is the last video on the Pope topic, but we'll get to this now. So I didn't really give much context there, but I think I should. So, he kisses the feet of South Sudan's warring rivals. So a rebel leader and the president and a former vice president during a retreat at the Vatican. And that was aimed at finding a path to peace. So, where else have you seen anyone take those extreme measures, right? To try to show that we are all one people, right? And we should be like I said, we have more in common than we do as differences. So I'd love to get your thoughts though on that particular gesture and what that meant to people on the continent and how people perceived it.
Yeah, and just to add to what you were saying about why this is important, and of course we all have our reservations, our beliefs, and things we're not with. But what we're discussing is why the continent of Africa, we have a lot of people who are Catholics that are grieving because the Pope died, and their grief is also important. And what we're doing is dissecting why, the importance of this story and what this man did. He may not have gotten it right all the time, but he was striving to help with making Africa as peaceful as it could, right? And this video of him, you could hear him struggling to kiss the feet of these leaders. But him lowering himself the way he did, right, was an extraordinary gesture of humility, And these leaders were people who were responsible. Some were responsible for years of civil war. So what he was doing was so symbolic because it was basically begging them, not as a politician, he was begging as a spiritual father, begging them to choose peace over power. Right? That was such a moving moment. And while, because of our conservative views in Africa, many condemned his openness, sorry to digress a bit, to blessing same-sex couples, I believe it was coming from a place of accepting everybody just as they are. I believe this was the intention behind it, not necessarily to go against Africa's values or anything like that. But yeah, that moment of him kissing the feet of those warring leaders will always be a very symbolic one and highly talked about.
Absolutely. And so, shifting gears a bit, we're going back to the AES/ECOWAS, and so I kind of mentioned earlier that there are other presidents around the continent of Africa that are warming up to the folks at the AES, and they understand how there's such a groundswell of support. And they align with a lot of what is happening in the AES. So Ghana's president, the newly elected president, John Mahama, who, by the way, Ibrahim Traore had gone to his inauguration. He has extended an invitation to the military leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to attend this week's 50th anniversary celebration of ECOWAS in Accra. The three Sahelian nations withdrew from the regional bloc this year, actually. And this video here is going to basically give a little bit more context to that, and then we will give our thoughts on the other side.
Ghana's President John Mahama has extended an invitation to the military leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to attend next week's 50th anniversary celebration of ECOWAS, taking place in Accra. The three Sahelian nations withdrew from the regional bloc after facing suspension threats following military takeovers. Since taking office in January, President Mahama has made restoring ties with these countries a top priority. Here's more from our Ghana correspondent, Justice Baidu.
Accra is set to take the center stage next week as the Economic Community of West African States marks 50 years of its formation. The city would be hosting high-ranking officials and leaders invited from across the sub-region in a move that has drawn some level of critique from democracy watchers. President John Mahama has extended an invitation to the leaders of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, the nations that withdrew from the bloc to set up the alliance of Sahelian states. Ghana has already appointed an envoy to repair relations between the country and these three states. ECOWAS insists that it took the decision to suspend these countries to stem the tide in the wave of coup takeovers that was sweeping across the sub-region around the time. Ghana sees itself as a strategic ally to these three countries, and new President John Mahama has insisted that it is in its interest that it fosters collaborations with these countries to help fight terrorism and promote economic cooperation.
Happens every time. So what are your thoughts, Gloria, on this particular story and Mahama extending the invitation to the three Sahelian states?
Yeah, and it is interesting that because this is an ECOWAS initiative, these are going to be his personal guests, or these are his personal guests. And clearly this is in a bid to help with the healing process. It's also interesting that Nigerian president and the current ECOWAS chair, Bola Tinubu, agreed to allow Mahama report on his engagements with the AES leaders at the upcoming heads of state meeting. So there will be a report given. I would like to be a fly on that wall, because it would be so interesting. Because he too realizes that ECOWAS needs the AES.
Absolutely.
Right? So this is a much more welcome reaction than the sanctions, than the suspension that have worsened tensions.
Yep.
Those didn't help anything. So now, will the three juntas return to ECOWAS? I'm not sure that this will happen, since what they want is complete autonomy from Western allied institutions. And now ECOWAS is turning 50. This is probably the most divided it's ever been, at least in recent history. West Africa has been fragmented, and Mahama, in traditional African terms, is now playing the role of the big brother, before things fall apart further. Without Mali, without Burkina Faso, without Niger, half of the Sahel region is outside the bloc.
Yep.
And again, China, Russia, Turkey are feeling the vacuum that ECOWAS created with the sanctions. And there's been a lot of disengagement from the West. So if the AES bloc succeeds in forming its own economic or military system, West Africa could end up splitting into two parts. There could be a Western-aligned ECOWAS, and there could be a Russia-aligned AES. So what Mahama is doing, he's just desperately trying, and I say that respectfully, he's desperately trying to restore dialogue. It's not going to necessarily be a full reintegration, at least for now, but at least they can have a conversation. At least a channel can be opened for them to be able to discuss aid, for them to talk migration, to talk regional security, because that's a big one, to avoid further isolation of these Sahel states with their populations that are already suffering from terrorism and food insecurity. So let's see if African diplomacy can solve African problems without any foreign interference.
Well put. Let's see. I think one of the biggest challenges I see here is I think there's a fear by some of the Western-backed countries of the same thing happening in their country, right? you know, these coups happened because it wasn't just a couple of military leaders deciding they want to take over. There was a groundswell. The country, the people of the country wanted that.
Yes.
And so that's why they spend so much time, you know, in these voluntary groups policing the streets themselves, like just regular citizens, to ensure that another coup doesn't happen. People all around the continent are watching what's happening in the AES, and I think it makes other leaders nervous, to be honest. So I like to see what you know, President Mahama is doing, and you know, his attempt to try to bridge the gap between these two groups. And you know, I do hope that it leads to more integration, but continued integration on Africa's terms instead of on the Western back terms, right? And so we'll have to see. We'll have to see what ends up happening here. But I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of those meetings. As you said, Mahama has gotten permission from Tinubu to report on those meetings. And so I'm interested to hear what comes out of those reports and what is said in those meetings. So hopefully it's a very productive one, and we'll see what happens.
And shout out to Tinubu for being open to that, because he could have insisted on keeping them sanctioned and suspended, but at least this is a step forward, I believe.
Fair. That's true. That's true. And not only were there sanctions, but there was even threats, you know, previously of military engagement, right? You know, they made different West African countries sign on to sending troops. And in fact, the former president of Ghana, Akufo-Addo, actually signed on, but many of the senators, I think it was, or the other parliament members disagreed, right? I remember them saying, no, we don't have the resources, first of all, to send there. Secondly, why? We don't need to. There's no point. Right. And so I'm glad that they, you know, obviously they never really followed through with that peace force or whatever it was that they had determined that they were planning to send. And tensions didn't rise to that point. Because then that would have been bad to see kind of a somewhat of a civil war within West Africa, and we wouldn't want to see that. So, yeah, I'm hoping to see how I'm looking forward to seeing how this sub-block of the continent works together, because obviously, as you mentioned, all the resources that those three countries have and the ability to negotiate that what they've been doing, all of West Africa can benefit from. The other countries see the AES trying to kick the West out, actually doing stuff for the people. The guy from Kenya was beyond trust talking about Traore. Oh, you mean Ruto? Yeah. Yes. I mean, of course, because he himself, you know, he fired his entire cabinet in a way to try to, you know, placate the youth that were protesting his rule. Because there's obviously fear in Kenya of a similar style attack, you know, takeover. Obviously, it's a lot harder to do in a country of that size, and it requires a lot of coordination. But you know, it's a fear. It's in the back of their minds. You know, when you see how some of these leaders ride around with their envoys, you know, of all of these guys with AK-47s, all these, you know, they obviously live in fear of a potential coup, especially when coups have happened in these countries before. But I think there's a difference between a coup and a revolution. I just want to mention that. I know we've been referring to this as a coup, but a coup is generally a couple of military leaders coming together and taking over a country. A revolution is when it's a groundswell from the people and they want it. And it still happens with a forceful takeover of power, but it's different because the people wanted it. So we're watching closely, and we'll continue to keep you guys posted on things as they develop in this area. All right. So shifting gears, we talked a little bit about you know, some of the symbolic moves and gestures and conversations that the Pope was having on the continent of Africa in service of peace between different religious groups. And there's currently a crisis happening in the Plateau State capital in Nigeria. The federal government has been asked by many people protesting to end the ongoing attacks on rural communities, which have claimed several lives in the past 3 weeks. They've made the call in a petition presented to the Plateau State government and governor for onward delivery of to President Bola Tinubu and see what they can do to to put an end to this violence. So I'm going to play a video and then we'll give some commentary on the other side.
Christians from various denominations united in a peaceful protest demanding an end to the violent attacks on their communities. Led by prominent church leaders, the protesters marched through major streets in Jos and converged at the Plateau State Government House in Rayfield. Speaking on behalf of the Christian leaders, President of the Church of Christ in Nations, Reverend Amos Munzo, decried the repeated, unprovoked attacks that have left many dead, others injured, and entire livelihoods destroyed. He warned that if immediate action is not taken, entire communities risk extinction.
We protest this renewed killing as a mark of honor for the death, a call to end all killings by armed Fulani herdsmen and other killers operating in our state in Nigeria.
Receiving the petition, Governor Caleb Mutfwang expressed gratitude to Plateau Christians for their unwavering prayers. In these trying times, he assured them that the government is working tirelessly to end the violence and restore peace.
The time has come when every Nigerian, every human being of conscience must arise to duty and say enough is enough. Keep standing with us. Keep praying with us. And by the grace of God, the troublemakers we see today, we will see them no more.
So I'd love to get your thoughts on this as you've hailed from Nigeria. Yeah. This is your country of origin. And there's a lot of talk about the Fulani or the Fula people, non-indigenous tribe to West Africa. Many people say they migrated from East Africa. The former president was of the Fulani tribe, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Sierra Leone's vice president is of the Fulani tribe, Fula tribe. So, obviously this is a tribe that in Guinea and in Nigeria, there's a lot of infighting between the indigenous tribes and this tribe. Can you speak to this a little bit and what's actually happened? Because this kind of speaks to the after effects, right? This is folks saying we need to make some adjustments here. But what actually has been happening over the last 3 weeks, and what do you know about this kind of these ethnic fights or these religious fights and killings that have been happening?
Yes, Plateau has been a target of ethno-religious conflicts for a very long time, and they have a diverse range of ethnicities. So you will have tensions arising, over issues such as land ownership, political representation, religious differences, all sorts of issues. And of course, the indigenous settler, which you referenced, the indigenous settler dichotomy, which has worsened these conflicts. Certain groups are considered who are considered indigenes, they're seen as enjoying more rights and privileges than settlers, right? So historically, it's been framed as farmer-herder disputes, but some would beg to argue. They would tell you this is targeted. They're still, with Plateau State, they're still trying to get the evidence that this was a religious thing. I mean, especially because it's around Easter, right? It definitely, at least we know for a fact that these are organized assaults. Of course, you have the suspicion of armed militias possibly taking advantage of the situation, the fact that there are religious differences, there are ethnic differences. But another thing that does stand out is the delayed response from security forces. This is what has really got a lot of people upset. The communities are now feeling more vulnerable. They're feeling more exposed. They're feeling more unprotected. I mean, the president was away in Paris, right? And people called him out. Like when the Pope died, he tweeted, and people were like, what have you tweeted regarding what's going on in Plateau? And he's asked governors to make sure they tackle it. And, dude, you are the chief security officer, right? Another state actually that has also there are other states, Borno, that it's just unfortunate the insecurity going on in Nigeria. But Benue too has been under attack this month. Scores of people have been killed. Benue has been a hotspot for the so-called farmer-herder conflicts, and I'm saying so-called because people are now going, no, it's not farmer. If you're having farmer and herders conflicting, then there's a clash, right? Well, it's just communities being attacked, people in their homes, going to people in their homes and killing children, killing women, killing men. So in Benue, it's been primarily between the Christian Tiv farmers and the Fulani herders, the Muslim Fulani herders. But people are saying it's a lot deeper than that. This thing is a religious thing. It's not about farmers versus herders. And what made this worse for Benue? There was an anti-grazing law in 2017 where they were trying to reduce the clashes so that the herders could roam. It just made things worse. It increased the tensions. It increased the attacks. It's like you pointed out, Buhari is Fulani, and it's like, and he was in power in 2017. Was this to favor the Fulani herdsmen? I think yes, Fulani herdsmen is one thing, but at the end of the day, these are people who are traceable. If the government is serious about restoring peace in Nigeria, they would handle it. These two states are experiencing huge displacement. Thousands of residents are fleeing their homes. I mean, there are clearly systemic issues in governance, and security is really, really threatened. It's like the people are there to secure themselves. It's just sad.
Yeah,
it's just so sad. And the sad thing, is that this has a ripple effect across Nigeria's entire middle belt, and this could actually threaten neighboring regions. So it is a national crisis, and a state of emergency should have been called.
Well put. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much else to add here. I think you've said it all. And so, I'm hoping to see, from the top down, they step up and step in and really put an end to this, because the resources are there. It's just a matter of if they decide that they're going to put the resources towards it.
Yes.
So with that, we're moving on to the last story of the escalation of conflict in Sudan. At least 33 people were experienced loss of life and dozens injured in a shelling by Sudan paramilitary rapid support force, or the rapid support force in the city of Darfur on Sunday. These attacks targeted populated areas in the city. And we're going to watch a video quickly and give some commentary on the other side.
Jonathan Ofe-Ansah joins me now live from London. He's the founder of Africa Briefing magazine. Welcome to you, Jonathan. As I just reported there, dozens of civilians killed. I mean, it's claimed by the RSF they were targeting Sudanese army headquarters there in Darfur. Do you think that's a legitimate explanation of what they were trying to do, or they're actually just trying to inflict lots of damage on civilians?
Well, it is both, actually, just to attack the army and also inflict injuries, harm onto the civilians. But look, this is a very, very serious development, because El-Fasher isn't just any city. It is the last army-held city in Darfur, and also the humanitarian center for the entire Darfur region. So it's very, very, serious development.
Are the RSF fighting just against the Sudanese army here, or are they also waging war in some areas against the public?
Well, the RSF, as we all know, is metamorphosed from the deadly Janjaweed, militia in the early to mid 90s. Janjaweed actually inflicted, a lot of atrocities in Western Darfur. So it has now become the RSF, and it appears that they are continuing, the atrocities that they committed so many years ago. So look, it is fighting both the army and also try to inflict damage on the innocent civilian population.
What is the ultimate game plan of the RSF here? Because millions of people have been displaced. They are fleeing the violence and the persecution that they have suffered at the hands of the RSF. I mean, I'm just wondering how many people are going to be left behind for the RSF to rule over if they were to win this conflict.
Well, that is that is war. I mean, it's trying to maybe use attack civilians and maybe use it as a leverage, you know, in order to win the war, or maybe use it as leverage, you know, during any peace negotiations.
Every time. You guys, you know, those watching may have heard the name Darfur previously, right? And you might have heard the Janjaweed, that name in passing, but maybe it might help to get a little bit of context to this larger story, the ongoing conflict in Sudan, and the differences between South Sudan and Sudan, right? Because I think there's also a misunderstanding that it's two separate countries now. And in this what's been happening here has been, it's an ongoing conflict. And so yeah, I'll turn it over to you if you want to speak to some of the historical context and then what's been happening recently.
Yes, the second, well, I hate to use the word anniversary, but the war in Sudan, you know, happened April 15, 2023. So April 15 was the second year that Sudan, you know, Sudan has been going through this chaos. And the declaration of a rival government by the RSF, I knew this would happen, you know, and they called it the government of peace and unity. But we know the RSF and the SAF is not without blame, right? But we know the atrocities that the RSF has committed. It's been very sad, you know, the rape of women and children, you know, displacing 13 million people, you know, people, innocent children, innocent women, civilians getting killed, you know, and you know, I think of Libya with the parallel governments. Sometimes I wonder if this is the only way Sudan can have some level of peace. Just so, and I'm not saying I want it, but the people need relief. I'm so concerned about the citizens of Sudan, and I'm even more concerned about the fact that the world is very silent when it comes to Sudan. And I also want to challenge, you know, our media personalities, our friends in the world of digital creation. I did a video on Sudan recently, which, you know, was also posted on your page. And I got a comment from somebody who is in this space that we're in, a very important, you know, influential person. And he said, thank you for talking about Sudan. It's a story that people stay away from. So thank you, Joe, for prioritizing Sudan and allowing us to talk about it. We can all say we want the world to talk about Sudan, but we have to consistently be interested in what's going on in Sudan, because it is the world's largest humanitarian crisis as we speak. And the international response has been so limited, right? We're talking aid. I mean, obviously, the situation with Trump, you know, coming for aid in Africa and all that is not helping. But the people are starving to death. You can't even imagine. And of course, the ethnic side of things, you know, there are reports of, and I'm going to say allegedly, of a cleansing, an ethnic cleansing. What is going on in Sudan is deep. We talk about Gaza, we talk about Ukraine. Sudan is going through a lot right now, and the world is keeping quiet, right? So the splitting of the country potentially, I don't know what that would look like. I just want, I'm desperate for the people of Sudan to just have peace, you know. It's just such a shame. It's so sad. And there are also reports of the RSF, you know, now the foreign interference, which is always the case with Africa, unfortunately, you know, the UAE is being alleged to be supporting the RSF. They've denied this. Russia, too, has been alleged to be supporting the RSF. SAF is alleged to be having backing from Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So this alleged foreign interference is actually complicating what could have been a peaceful resolution
Right.
But the conflict is being sustained because of all these alleged interference. But anyway, please let's remember Sudan and keep prioritizing what's going on in Sudan. The people, man, it's a nightmare that you can't even imagine.
Absolutely. And I'll say, you know, as you mentioned, you know, a couple of days ago marked 2 years since the start of Sudan's devastating war. You know, we're going to play a clip from African Stream CEO Ahmed Caballo as he explains to TRT News Channel how the proxy conflict can be brought to an end. So there is a way that this can be brought to an end. It's actually a pretty simple solution, and he's going to talk about it. But this so-called international community needs to pressure the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, the main supplier of weapons to the RSF paramilitary, which has been receiving funds and logistical support from Abu Dhabi. The biggest hindrance to that is the US, whom the UAE is a vital ally in the Middle East. This 2 years of brutal fighting have torn Sudan apart. Half the population is facing acute hunger. Millions are displaced, either internally or in camps across the border. The destruction of hospitals and the wider health system has not only been aggravated the humanitarian catastrophe, but also made you know, reporting a number of people killed and injured next to impossible. You can't accurately report it. So this but any reasonable estimate, tens of, if not hundreds of thousands have died. So with that, I'm going to play this video from Ahmed speaking to TRT, and then we'll have some final commentary on this topic.
You fear, Ahmed, that is exactly how it's going to play out because these two sides are locked in essentially a stalemate with two very powerful competing armies or fighting groups, if you like. And it doesn't appear that one can get the upper hand over the other.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's really important to have international pressure. This is a gun-for-hire mercenary group. When they committed their crimes in Darfur in 2003, it's because they were being funded, armed, and supported by the Sudanese army. Now they're committing their crimes in Darfur and the rest of Sudan. It's because they're being funded, supported by the United Arab Emirates and its client states in the region, like Chad, like Uganda, like Ethiopia, and also Kenya, where I reside. So what is needed is to cut off the supply routes. If you cut off the supply routes to the RSF, this war will end in a matter of months. But there is no real desire by the international community to do that. 3 months ago, the United States declared that there's a genocide happening committed by the RSF in the Darfur area. What has followed that? Has there been any concrete action against the UAE, which is a principal key ally for the United States in the Persian Gulf? No, there hasn't. So we need to stop talking that we want peace and start acting like we want peace. One phone call from Donald Trump telling the UAE to stop supplying arms and funds and logistical support to the RSF could end this war. And that's why it's so frustrating when people say, oh, we're at a stalemate, nothing can be done. Yes, something can be done. We need to cripple the supply line to the RSF, and this war will be over, and the people in the Zamzam refugee camps will be liberated, and the people of Darfur will be liberated, and the people of Sudan will be able to return home. They're languishing in refugee camps in Ethiopia. They're languishing in Egypt. All they want to do is return home, and they're sick and tired of these platitudes towards peace when they know it's very simple action to stop the fighting.
It is a brutal situation and a brutal civil war. Ahmed, we thank you very much indeed. We'll leave it there. Appreciate you joining us on the News Hour.
I mean, I think he said it all there, right? I mean, very impassionate plea. And by the way, Ahmed is Sudanese, right? So there's a direct personal, a connection to the country. And his father was a political prisoner and also targeted by the former administration there. So he has a deep-rooted understanding and connection to the conflict that's happening there. But yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on everything he said about the solutions. It seems simple enough.
Yeah, kill the source. You know, the supply, just starve it. Because clearly, and like the foreign countries that I mentioned are alleged to be fueling these tensions, there has to be a cut somewhere. And this brings, and shout out to Ahmed. I was going to say Ahmed, African Stream, doing an incredible job of highlighting this. You know, we can say people are not talking about it enough, but he definitely speaks about it. He could be from there and just choose not to touch on it. But, you know, he's been a vessel and we truly appreciate him. And this makes me think about the African Union. Where is the African Union in all this? Right. So they suspended Sudan when the war broke out, you know, and then they come back later and they're like, okay, let's have some peace talks. Let's talk. They go to Addis Ababa, they go to Cairo, but these moves didn't gain any traction. And both parties in Sudan even ignored the calls for the peace talks to show that they don't even consider you important, and they would rather ally or you know, meet with countries such as Egypt, UAE, and Russia. So the AU has work to do, and it's not just Sudan. The AU has work to do. Why you were established was to unite the continent, Africa. Like literally, that's what you stand for. But we just don't need you to come out with statements. We need you to actually, is there some sort of crisis fatigue going on in Africa? Mm-hmm. We don't need you to just talk about it. We need you to be about it. There is a crisis going on in Sudan. The AU has a lot of work to do. Listen to Ahmed. The things he's proposing, these are simple, like you said, they're simple solutions. Please, people are dying. That's all I have to add to that. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's really important, and I think one of the challenges we have as a people is unless it's one group of people who looks different, you know, subjugating another group, it seems like that's the only time these conversations happen on a global stage, right? So it's clear there's a group subjugating another group in a certain region in the Gaza Strip in particular, right? And everybody is posting, you know, free Palestine. I can't tell you how many you know, people whose platforms or their social media handles and everything say free Palestine. And I think it's important to because I agree and I align with that, you know, but also Sudan, DRC, right, and other parts of the world too. I mean, even Myanmar and you know, even the Uyghurs in China, right? There are many groups being subjugated. And I think it's when it's a group that it seems like these two different groups that are of the same tribe or ethnic background are fighting each other, we kind of ignore it. It's kind of the same thing in the United States, right? You know, when it comes to our, you know, our Black and brown communities. And so, yeah, I would really like to see more people talk about these kinds of things. That's why we wanted to make sure we talked about this. And of course, we ended the live stream with this particular story because we wanted to spend some more time on it. And because, you know, just frankly, more people end up showing up on the live streams during this time. So you guys are all hearing this story and what's happening. But yeah, so, you know, look, Ahmed said it. There's a simple solution. You cut it off at the source. Because the United States loves to put sanctions on countries. That's their favorite thing to do. They do it to Russia, they do it to Iran, you know, sanctions galore. Everybody gets sanctions. So it'd be nice if the UAE got sanctioned for obviously funding what the US has already called a genocide, right? If you cut it off at the source, you eliminate that problem and they can begin to at least fight against this and put an end to it. So yeah, so I will leave it at that. Before we end the live stream, any other final words on today's topics or anything you want to leave the people with today?
Three words. Talk about Sudan.
Talk about Sudan. I like it. And then I will say, make sure you guys continue to join us on these live streams. I see a bunch of people joining from Gloria's YouTube, so welcome to you all. I see some folks that stayed on from mine, so this is great. But we'll be doing this every Thursday, as I mentioned previously. We'll be doing this Thursday, 9 p.m. GMT. So that's generally half the year, that's 5 p.m. Eastern. The other half the year, that's 4 p.m. Eastern. So just pay attention to the time, the 9 p.m. GMT. And so we'll continue to do these live streams on Thursdays. because we want to ensure that we're bringing you this knowledge weekly. And so that's why we reinstated this. And I'm glad Gloria is here. She's a wealth of knowledge and impassioned individual. So, you know, we're going to continue to bring these stories. And so stay tuned. Continue to stay tuned. Even if you don't know what you can do to help, at least be educated. You know, that's the first step to being able to make any change, is knowing exactly what's happening, right? So let's start with that. So with that, I want to say, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to all the channels in the description, all the platforms. I got Gloria's social media in the description. My social media is in the description. So depending on where you're watching, just make sure we all cross-pollinate and we all subscribe everywhere. Gloria does a ton of great content. We're now collaborators on Instagram, so you'll see Gloria stuff on my page as well. But again, we'll be back on Thursday. And I won't be going live this coming Monday. I will probably find another day next week to go live. I usually go live on Mondays, but I won't be able to do that since I will be traveling to Miami. So while I'm out of the state, I won't be able to go live because I have some other obligations. But thanks again, everybody, for watching. If you haven't already, hit that like button. Share this with anybody you know who wants to know what's going on the continent. So thanks for watching. We'll see you guys all on the next video.
Thank you all. Thank you, Joe.
Of course. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.